How many civilians will die this week in Eastern Ghouta? Activists on the ground report 31 killed on Monday, 78 on Tuesday, at least 23 earlier on. It's only Wednesday. The Assad government pounding the besieged rebel-held enclave near the capital as the United Nations pleads for a truce to allow in aid deliveries. Nearly 7 years into the civil war, the brutality includes fresh claims of chemical weapons use by Damascus. Assad and his Russian and Iranian backers pressing their advantage in places like Eastern Ghouta and Idlib province, where over the weekend, rebels shot down a Russian Su-25 jet and killed its pilot. What's the view on this over in Moscow? With ISIS nearly out of the picture in Syria, we're going to see how the chess pieces are moving in different directions now. Turkey's foreign minister paying a surprise visit to his Iranian counterpart this Wednesday. The Turks, who back the Sunni Arab rebels fighting Assad, but who've instead opened up Syria's newest front to take on Kurds across their Turkish border, the same Kurds who fought ISIS. For Turkey's NATO partners, where do the red lines really lie? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at a de-escalation, well, that isn't happening. And with us from Rome, his Syria Comments blog is always a must-read. Joshua Landis heads the Middle East Studies program at the University of Oklahoma. Nice to see you, Joshua.
Pleasure.
From Moscow, Andrei Kortunov, Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. Thank you for joining us again.
Good evening.
From New York, Tony Bedran, Research Fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Nice to see you.
Thank you for having me.
And here in the studio, we're joined by Franco-Syrian journalist and photojournalist Amar Abed Robbo. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. It's supposed to be one of those so-called de-escalation zones. In Eastern Ghouta, the reality on the ground tells another tale. Simon Harding has more.
Bombs pounding away at rebel-held enclaves. Airstrikes specifically targeted Damascus's Eastern Ghouta suburbs, where 400,000 people have been trapped since 2013. Bombs in the town of Douma and Harasta were particularly deadly. These latest airstrikes are part of the government's offensive to recapture major rebel strongholds in western Syria. Idlib, in the north, has also been bombarded. The United Nations are also investigating claims that chemical weapons were used after civilians accused Bashar al-Assad's troops of using chlorine bombs.
2 bombs fell on us. There was a small explosion. Someone said chlorine, chlorine. After 10 minutes we started to suffocate. Some began vomiting and others were screaming. Then the civil defence team saved us and drove us to the hospital.
The UN have called for an immediate ceasefire to allow aid to reach the besieged areas. They have requested that this truce should last at least a month.
Joshua Landis, why this campaign against Eastern Ghouta at this time?
Syrian government is trying to retake the remaining rebel enclaves in Syria. As we've seen recently, there's been a scramble for the rest of Syria. The United States has taken about 28% in the north. The Turks are now trying to broaden their security band around their border. And Assad is trying to take as much of the rebel-controlled territory as he possibly can. And this has caused a sharp uptick in the violence in Syria.
It's caused a sharp uptick. We've been covering, all these peace talks, the ones that have been taking places in Astana and Geneva and Sochi. Is that a waste of time devoting airtime on the news to those?
Largely, the Geneva process, which is backed by the United States and European powers, hasn't gotten off the ground because its key element is the removal of Assad. And there is no policy on the part of the West to actually remove him. So this goes around in circles. The Sochi process, which is led by Russia, is designed to get the surrender of the remaining rebel factions. And so those are the two basic avenues, but this war is going to be settled on the ground through military measures. Turkey has figured that out, the United States did, and now Syria, of course, is trying to take more land. And it looks like the peace talks haven't made much progress.
Robbo, what's your reaction when you hear Joshua Landis say that this war is going to be solved militarily on the ground?
Well, when you think about it, a year ago, or a little bit more than a year ago, when Aleppo was taken by the regime and the Russians and the Lebanese militias, etc., everybody was telling us it's over. Assad has won. This is finished. This is over, etc. I heard it in many news reports. We can see more than a year later that nothing is over. We're still in it. There are new fronts. There are new actors, let's say, who are helping themselves, or like a self-service. You know, they come in and it's chaos. So yes, nothing is over. It's still probably a long process. Nothing says that you mentioned Astana and Sochi and Geneva. In none of these meetings, the Syrian regime of Assad has shown any will to end the war. Every time the same system, they besiege an area, they get people to die from hunger, they then pound them, they tell them you can leave this area to a safe area. This is what we're told the people of Aleppo last year, where they were taken to Idlib. And Idlib and Sarakib and many areas are today being shelled in a horrible way. We are not even shocked by the word chemical anymore. I mean, it's there, it's a chemical weapon, but it could be any kind of weapon. Nothing has been spared to the Syrians. I mean, it's really terrible. So yes, it is still a long war. It is not finished. And the Syrians are probably the civilians are the ones who are every day suffering and paying this terrible price.
Andrei Kortunov, do you agree with Robbo that predictions that the end is near, Assad has won, were overstated, and that everybody is bogged down in this quagmire?
Well, I think that if we look back into last year, definitely there were some success stories. We can talk, for example, about southwest Syria. I think that the Amman agreement worked fairly fine, and there was a degree of cooperation between Russians and Americans in this particular corner of Syria. However, having said that, I do agree that it's not the end of story. And the war will continue to go on as long as it is fed from the outside. Because it's not just about Syrians. Now what we see is a proxy war which somehow sucks in regional powers, including Iran and Turkey, and indirectly a number of Gulf states as well, and Israel to some extent as well, but also outside powers, and definitely Russia and the United States stand out as the major outside powers engaged in these military activities.
Engaged in those military activities from afar, we have a limited presence of both the United States and Russia on the ground, Andrei Kortunov. The shooting down of that Russian fighter plane over the weekend, does that change the calculus in any way for Moscow?
I think it might change the calculus if we indeed find out that the opposition to Bashar Assad has acquired significant numbers of anti-aircraft weapons, because the natural advantage of Bashar Assad has always been that the opposition could not really oppose the air dominance of Damascus and Moscow, or the United States and Israel in this part of the world. And right now, if they got this new type of weapons, I think it might really change the situation, and it was very difficult to predict what will happen if these weapons get into Syria in plenty.
Tony Badran, your reaction to what's going on and to something that Amir Robbo said a short while ago, the chemical weapons attacks claims are happening and they're being met with a lot of indifference.
I wouldn't say indifference. It's just an awkward response considering when you measure it against what happened in the spring. But the problem is that what happened in the spring was a sarin gas attack, and the United States and the international community as a whole have to now determine whether chlorine gas attacks are to be treated with the same type of measures as happened in the spring. I think they should. The strikes deterred the regime from using sarin. Even the chlorine has been, the use of which has been a lot less than what it had been prior to the strike. But I do think that targeted strikes right now against the regime facilities, like what we saw even the Israeli strike earlier today or yesterday. I think something of this nature would reestablish those firm red lines that President Trump drew in the spring.
Joshua Landis, do you agree?
I think the Americans can change the balance of power at any time they want to. The U.S. is very strong, and Tillerson and Obama before him both have tried to make some kind of distinction between chlorine, which isn't quite as lethal as nerve gas, and because they don't really want to get involved in this issue. And that raises the question that Tony has brought up, is where does America want to draw that red line? How involved do they want to get? And, this is the real problem, because, of course, it raises the other question is, why stop at chemical weapons? Why not get involved for all the other deaths that are taking place, which are, of course, much more numerous than those caused by the chlorine gas? And it really underlines the question that the United States has wanted to destroy ISIS, which it has done largely. And now the question is, does it want to go the next step and take on the Assad regime? Tillerson just the other day stated that the United States was going to remain in Syria, in northern Syria, not only until ISIS was destroyed, but until the Assad regime was finished and the UN was able to carry out elections in Syria. This is a tall order, and I think the United States isn't quite clear whether it really wants to do that and what kind of policy it wants to pursue. Should chemical weapons be the lever that it uses in order to get rid of Assad? And many opponents of the regime want the United States to make that move now. I think that the Secretary of Defense and probably the President are hesitant. They've got Korea on the list. They've got another bunch of problems that they're dealing with. I don't think they want to get too involved.
And Joshua, you heard Andrei Kortunov mentioning
which
there.
has always been the problem.
You heard Andrei Kortunov mentioning how if the rebels have anti-aircraft batteries, that might change the thinking in Moscow. On the U.S. side, if some of those special forces get killed on the ground, would that make the U.S. have a rethink?
It could, and Turkey has, in a sense, been threatening to take on the Kurds that the United States has been supporting in northern Syria. We'll see if Turkey really does that. My hunch is that the United States and Turks will sit down and they won't come to blows. But clearly there's a lot of positioning here, and both Assad and the Turks have an interest in trying to needle the United States and see how committed is it to its Syria policy. Can they drive it out? Neither power, not Iran, not Russia, not Turkey, want the United States there. And in many ways, by grabbing 30% of Syria, the United States has driven together in an alliance Turkey, Iran, Russia, which under normal conditions have been enemies.
Andrei Kortunov, you agree?
No,
Well, you know, I think that this alliance has other reasons to exist. I think that there are overlapping interests of Iran, Turkey, and Russia in Syria. They want to preserve the integrity of the country. They want to secure borders of Syria. I think they are concerned about potential disintegration. But definitely the alliance between the United States and Kurds in particular created a new situation for everybody concerned, because it alienated Turks, and this is something that we should keep in mind. But for Russia, it posed a very difficult question of selecting or choosing between Kurds and Turks. And as we see, the Russian leadership has tilted towards Turks. And right now, if you talk to many Kurdish spokesmen, they would say that Russia betrayed the Kurdish movement. And it is important to note that Kurds were not present in Sochi, which clearly inflated the value of the event.
All right, and we're going to be going to Syrian Kurdistan when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
French Connections, presented by Florence Villeminot.
They're known for their cuisine and saying hello with a kiss. They only work 35 hours per week, when they're not on strike, that is. How true are these cliches about France? Every week, Florence Villeminot tears apart stereotypes. Join us for insight into French culture and current events to understand what makes the French so unique.
French Connections on France 24 and France24.com. Revisited, presented by Stuart Norval.
On June the 5th, 1967, the Israeli army invaded Egyptian Sinai, unleashing a war that would change the face of the Middle East. During the Six-Day War, Israel took rapid possession of the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and the Old City of Jerusalem, holy sites for Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike. It's a stranglehold that the Israeli authorities have maintained to this day.
The Temple Mount and the Western Wall will forever remain under Israeli sovereignty.
50 years later, East Jerusalem still symbolizes the ascendancy of Israel, whose settlements policy has created tensions which are as strong today as ever and make the atmosphere in Jerusalem unique in the world.
Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories Laura Cellier is following for you in the newsroom. And there's a deal in Germany to form another grand coalition. Angela Merkel to be chancellor for a fourth time in a grand coalition with the Social Democrats. Martin Schulz, who's stepping down as SPD party leader to become foreign minister. Now, you'll hear about how some inside of the CDU of Merkel are complaining that too many choice cabinet posts are going to that opposition party. Emmanuel Macron okayed to include a mention of Corsica in the constitution, but in a speech before a nationalist-dominated regional assembly, the French president rejecting most demands for greater autonomy. After the French capital's biggest snowfall in 30 years, the Paris area braced for a steep drop in temperatures that could turn roads into ice skating rinks. Europe's markets finish in positive territory for the first time in a week. So is it all over for the big losses of recent days? Kate Moody will have more in business. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're seeing how, well, ever since the pushing out almost entirely of ISIS from Syria, there's been, as one of our panelists, Joshua Landis, has said, a sort of a new scramble for Syria. Joshua Landis, who heads the Middle East Studies program at the University of Oklahoma and who joins us from Rome. From Moscow, Andrei Kortunov, Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. From New York, Tony Badran of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, and Franco-Syrian journalist and photojournalist Amr Abed Robbo. Welcome back to all of you. Just before the break, we were talking about how Syria has, well, its newest front, Ankara launching Operation Olive Branch against Syrian Kurdish militias in Afrin. That's near the border with Turkey. This to stop or to cut a potential rear guard base for Turkey's PKK Kurdish insurgency. Now, the Turkish foreign minister in Tehran this Wednesday, right after Iran's president Hassan Rouhani had criticized the offensive in Afrin, Syrian Kurdish fighters accusing the Turkish army of shelling a primary school and a water plant. The Laurent Berstecker has more on that new front in Afrin.
Holding olive branches and portraits of fallen fighters, hundreds of Kurds converged to the city of Afrin to protest against what they say is unjustified aggression by Turkey.
We came all the way here to confront the danger with our own eyes and to send a message to Erdogan, to tell him that we will not leave the land of Afrin until our last drop of blood is spilt. We will not leave.
Turkey launched a major operation last month to oust YPG forces from the Kurdish enclave of Afrin. Ankara considers the YPG, a Kurdish militia, as an offshoot of the separatist Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is branded a terrorist organization by Turkey and its allies. But the YPG is also the US-led coalition's main partner in the fight against the Islamic State group in Syria, and Turkey's latest offensive has sparked fears of a diplomatic rift with Washington. Far from trying to appease tensions, however, Recep Tayyip Erdogan lashed out at US military presence in the region and vowed to expand operations to target the strategic town of Manbij in Syria.
Who did the US bring to Manbij? The PYD, the YPG and the PKK. You took them there, and now you're telling us not to come to Manbij? We will come to Manbij and give the land back to its true owners.
Turkey and the US are NATO allies, yet relations have been tense since the start of the Syrian civil war, in which they support opposing sides. A Turkish attack on Manbij, where US troops are currently stationed, would mark a major escalation between the two countries.
Let's cross to northern Syria now. France 24's Maïssa Awad was in Manbij just 24 hours ago. Maïssa, we heard in that report Turkey's president saying, "We will come to Manbij." What were the reactions of the locals there?
Well, François, it was very interesting to see that in Manbij life goes on as usual. But militarily speaking, things are a bit more complicated. The city is controlled by Manbij Military Council, the MMC, that consists of Kurds, Arabs, Turkmen. 90% of its fighters are Arabs. I spoke to the leader of the council. He told me that his fighters are on high alert, that they are consolidating their positions in order to be able to answer any artillery from the strike from the Turkish side or any fighter jet strikes. On the other hand, also it was very interesting to notice this sense of confidence that was conveyed by this leader, that Americans will not leave Manbij, especially after the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan urged Washington to withdraw its troops. He told me that, on the contrary, the coalition has increased its patrols alongside the separation lines between the MMC and the Euphrates Shield fighters. And also it was interesting to know that today coalition commanders paid an official visit to Manbij, a visit that was described, and here I quote coalition spokesman, as a great trip to Afrin. So all of this can be interpreted as a clear message to Ankara from the coalition, from Washington, not to transform its words into action.
Tony Badran, do you share the optimism that was expressed to our correspondent there, that if push comes to shove, the United States will choose the Kurds over the Turks?
I wouldn't put it in those terms. Number one, I will say that I don't believe that the Turks are going to be attacking an area where the United States is. So I think the Turks are basically bargaining and they're negotiating. The Turks, this is why I disagree with what Professor Landis said earlier. There is no coalition of Turkey, Iran, and Russia in here. We just talked about how they were fighting and how they've introduced manpads that have maybe shot a Russian plane. Turkey is negotiating to increase its position. What it wants the United States in Syria, it just wants it on its side, not on the side of the Kurds. So it wants to move the United States away from the Kurds towards an alliance with Turkey and its forces. The United States is probably going to try to chart a middle path in this. It wants to reestablish the alignment with Turkey, which Obama had completely destroyed in his pro-Iran policy in Syria. And it wants to do so while at the same time maintaining its infrastructure and its scaffolding on which its position is based in eastern Syria and northern Syria, which is also now going to take an anti-Iran component as well, which, by the way, is a component that the Turks agree with. The Turks
they agree with it, you say, Tony,
but
how do you explain that visit by the Turkish foreign minister to Tehran?
Because there are lots of tensions happening, especially in Idlib. For instance, when the Turks moved in their military to take positions in Idlib, they came under attack by Iran's militias. So Iran doesn't want Turkey to establish itself either in Syria. These guys are rivals. And by the way, Iran has long helped the PKK attack Turkey, for instance, going back to 2012. So there is no trust on this issue between them. So I think the notion that Turkey would prefer to have the Kurdish groups aligned with Russia, Assad, and Iran potentially all along its border is not something that they want to see. So I think the United States is going to try to impress that on them, that it would be much better to have the United States in control of this, but they need to reach an agreement to take in Turkish anxieties into consideration and to bring Turkish assets into some of these areas, be it Manbij, be it elsewhere. It all remains to be seen.
Joshua Landis, do you agree on that last point with Tony Badrin?
Well, clearly, many Americans are hopeful that they can support the Kurds in northern Syria against Assad and Iran, and that Turkey will accept this, and that they can find an accommodation with Turkey, and that America can proceed to have good relations with both the YPG and with Turkey. But we've seen over the last 2 decades that the U.S. has destroyed its, not destroyed it entirely, but has hurt its relations badly with Turkey by supporting Kurds. First in Iraq, where Turkey refused to allow the United States to move troops across Turkey into Iraq because they did not want the United States to side with the Kurds. Now the same thing has happened in Syria, and Erdogan is livid. He believes that if the Kurds get armed, they are going to give those arms and help the Kurds of eastern Turkey revolt, rise up, kill Turks, and secede from Turkey, the same way that the Syrian Kurds and the Iraqi Kurds are trying to secede from their countries as well. So he is very worried that this is going to destroy the national security of Turkey. And the United States seems to believe that he's not really serious about this. And that has led from bad to worse. Turkey was the main enemy of Assad and was not on great relations with Russia. It shot down a Russian plane. Now, today we're seeing Turkey has been forced, and I agree with Tony that Turkey doesn't want to be Russia's ally particularly, or certainly not Assad's ally. But increasingly, there are voices being raised in Turkey saying, you've got to make friends with Assad because we want to hurt the Kurds more than we want to hurt Assad. And that's the danger. The United States seems to be convinced that it can somehow thread this needle.
Andrei Kortunov, is Recep Tayyip Erdogan today have more in common with Washington or with Moscow?
Well, of course, Turkey is a NATO member, and I don't think it is likely to change. However, we see that over years, Turkey is drifting further and further away, not just from the United States, but from the West at large. I think that there are major disappointments in Turkey about how it is treated by the European Union and France in particular. But also, I think that we should not underestimate the importance of relations between Erdogan and Putin. They might not necessarily trust each other, but there are major common interests between the two countries which go beyond Syria. Look, for example, the energy deal between Russia and Turkey. This is an important piece of business which unites Ankara and Moscow. Look at the recent decision of Erdogan to purchase the newest air defense systems from Russia, so-called S-400. This is a very unorthodox step by a non-NATO member. Many would say that both countries are moving away from Western democratic models towards more authoritarianism. So I wouldn't say that it's just a situational alliance between Russia and Turkey. I think it's more than that, and I don't think that this trend will stop anytime soon.
All right, you mentioned the ire directed by Ankara at France. On French radio this morning, the Foreign Minister, Jean-Yves Le Drian, asked if Turkey is violating international law. Let's listen.
It is being violated by Turkey, by the Damascus regime, by Iran and those who are attacking Eastern Ghouta and Idlib.
Are we in the process of abandoning those who fought Islamic State?
Not at all. The political transition process in Geneva must be put together. If not, there is no resolution. The political transition process includes all the zones affected by the crisis.
Are you demanding the withdrawal of the Turkish army?
The withdrawal of all those who have nothing to do in Syria. All those who have nothing to do in Syria, including Iranian militias, including Hezbollah. This is the situation. We cannot focus on a single point. Ensuring the security of Turkey's borders does not mean killing civilians, and that's reprehensible. We must not, in a very dangerous, dramatic situation in Syria, add war onto war.
Amr Abdullah, your reaction to that exchange?
It's terrible. I mean, we've heard Mr. Kotinov talking about Syrian integrity and respect of borders, and saying that all these actors have this on their priority list or something like that. But actually, they're all raping this.
But your reaction is there to what you heard from the French foreign minister.
To the French foreign minister, of course, I agree with him, but I can do nothing about it. What is he doing about it? Where's the power of France? Where's the power of Europe? I mean,
and what could France do about it?
Well, they could work for a no-fly zone. We've been asking for this for 5 years now. They have definitely a voice in Europe. I mean, President Macron is very popular all over with many head of states. He could do something about it. When he said himself that there are two red lines for him. The first one is the use of chemicals, and we see it's happening. And the second one is the besieging civilians and depriving them from humanitarian aid. And this is also happening in the Ghouta, and this is happening in Idlib. So both red lines are being crossed. What are we doing? Mr. Le Drian goes to TV or goes to the radio to talk, but what is he really doing? Where's the position of France? Where's the work? Even in the UN, I mean, we can see in the UN that Russia wants to block any resolution. What is France doing practically? I mean, these declarations are nice, but we've been hearing declarations for 7 years now. Where at one moment are we going to say there is a no-fly zone, but there is a protection of civilians?
Is public opinion in France ready to follow the imposition, for instance, what you're just mentioning there, a no-fly zone?
I think the public opinion in France is usually supportive of the Syrian civilians or of other civilians. It's not something totally disconnected from the public opinion. And then sometimes I think leaders have also to take stand that is a bit different from public opinion if this is what they fear.
Joshua Landis, sitting in Rome, your thoughts on Is there anything that Europe can do to pressure all sides?
You know, unfortunately, the foreign policy of the United States and the West has really descended to the lowest common denominator. And that foreign policy is to keep Syria weak, divided, and poor in order that Iran and Russia cannot win in Syria. They're trying to turn Syria into a swamp for Russia and Iran. This will protect America's allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia, and it will hurt its enemies, Iran and Russia. I think that is at the level of what America thinks it can achieve, and it's doing that by remaining in northern Syria, which includes 50% of Syria's oil and gas, much of its best water supplies and best agriculture. And by maintaining those resources and keeping them away from Assad, the Russians, and Iran, Assad will not be able to rebuild, the country will stay poor, and America's allies will remain protected, and Iran will be hurt. I think that is really at the level of America's ambition today. They do not have a policy that will overturn Assad and change the balance of power in Syria.
Mr. Landis, I'm sorry to say that, but the way you are presenting things sound like as if Syria, the Syrian regime, Assad regime, the Iranians, the Hezbollah, and the Russians have a very ambitious and a very good policy to Syria, and that the West is trying to keep it poor and divided. I really don't agree with this. I think that all these actors we are talking about are not helping the Syrian people, are not helping the civilians, and it's their least concern. The wealth
on
of
all
Syria,
sides is the well-being of
course.
the Syrians.
Of course, I don't want people who are listening to you to think that there is a good side that is Russia and the Iranians, and the bad side that would be the West. This is not true.
Joshua Landis?
Well, I agree. You know, there isn't a good side here. The trouble is that the Syrian people are going to get the worst of both worlds. They're going to get a divided Syria that has no resources, that cannot rebuild. The West has pledged that it will not help Assad rebuild, but they're not going to remove Assad. And Russia will defend him, and Iran will defend him, and Syria will remain in this state of violent weakness. And unfortunately, there isn't an ambition by anybody to really change this balance of power. And so Syria is stuck in a very bad situation. And it's the Syrian people who are going to be sacrificed on this table of great powers and the great game. So, and that's just, I mean, I hate to say it that way, but it seems very brutally the reality.
Tony Badran, do you agree?
Well, I mean, I agree with Mr. Abdul that to present no good sides here is a gross equivalence. I mean, it's the people who have destroyed Syria and who have sent these millions of refugees. Okay, it's not the United States, and it's it's the Assad regime and its allies, right? I mean, these are the people who are bombarding and who are using chemical weapons and destroying. Incidentally, the people who are going to be living in eastern Syria outside Assad's grip, or if we can establish a true, let's say, zone of ceasefire, whether under Turkish areas or under, in the south, maybe under someone else's umbrella, be it a Russian-American umbrella or something, I have a very hard time believing that these people are going to actually say that they are lamenting the fact that Syria is divided, because they will have at least a chance at normalcy. The question is whether we should be retroactively financing Assad's genocidal campaign of the last 7 years by giving him and his cronies money. I think that is both strategically misguided and morally obscene.
All right, so many more questions to ask on that point. Unfortunately, the clock is running short, so I want to thank you, Tony Badran in New York. I want to thank Joshua Landis in Rome, Andrei Kortunov in Moscow, and Amar Abed Robbo. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon. Yeah, this sort of scramble for Syria and the well-being of the civilians kind of comes last in the thinking of all the powers that are involved.
Certainly, and social media is putting a spotlight on the suffering of the civilian population, Francois. I'll start with one image that goes back to last October that really, I think, grabbed public attention about the real suffering on the ground and the problem of malnutrition of children, for example. There was one child, and the image is, I hasten to add, distressing, but it went all over the web. This was on our own sister radio channel, RFI's website on the 11th of October, the 21st of October, rather, this child did actually pass away from malnutrition. And you can see completely skeletal there. So that was a shocking image that I think drew the attention to the fact that NGOs and humanitarian groups were not getting the needed aid to the civilian population in Ghouta. And you can see there are images coming through today as well. I showed that image going back to October because it's been verified. We know for a fact that that was because a lot of the time you have to be cautious, of course, of what's going on social media. It's also a tool of misinformation and propaganda, and we've seen it many times in the past images that turned out to be taken at a different time or in a different place. So all of those, the images that I'm showing now, I suppose go with that caveat, and I've filtered out the most distressing ones. Warplanes over our heads in East Ghouta now, and you can see images going up on social media showing, exactly what it says. Ghouta is bleeding is another hashtag that is doing the rounds of social media. That's the one that has a lot of images that I would say be cautious. Graphic, they're distressing, and we can't be 100% sure, I suppose, of the source of some of those images. The children of East Ghouta have not gone to school in 45 days. They play in the street while they should be in school. The children here in Ghouta also need food and clothes. Now, this is Bana Alabed. You'll remember that Twitter account being infamous when it first emerged. It is actually this little 8-year-old girl's English-speaking mother who moderates that account from Aleppo. I don't know why the world is just watching little children dying in Syria. More than 100 people were killed. We also have this tweet here. The people of Ghouta are living in a hell not much different from that of Idlib. At least 54 civilians have been killed today, dozens more injured by the regime and Russian air and ground attacks on residential areas of the Ghouta region.
Robbo, you have covered the Syrian civil war. As we know, we're journalists who are on the ground in some parts, but in Eastern Ghouta, in Idlib, are there photojournalists, Western photojournalists?
Western, unfortunately.
Or working for Western agencies?
Yes, there are working for Western agencies. There are people that have been trained and about these issues of ethics. So most of the things that are, all of the things that come through major agencies have been verified and vetted.
Okay. This is another piece of information. Mohanad, one of Sam's nurses in besieged Ghouta, passed away this morning after he was injured by an airstrike. Hospitals in Ghouta received over 200 injuries since early this morning because of airstrikes. So I think it's quite powerful that we have stories, individual stories like that coming through that put in a face on the suffering and the consequences of the humanitarian, the lack of humanitarian help. I'll finish with this tweet, which actually has a screen grab of one of our own reports on this in this regard. According to France 24, tens of Syrian civilians in Ghouta died after suffering from chlorine attacks. So that is another element that is getting a slightly lighter note here, if you can possibly have one. The channel forgot to explain to the audience about the magic behind the kufiya, and you can see here actually somebody using the Arabic headscarf, well, I suppose to protect himself or herself from the gas. So that's a slightly grisly take, or humorous take on a grisly topic, I suppose.
Glib, shall we say. Many thanks for that, James Creedon. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.